So I'm just going to make a couple of reflections on Young Lives' experience of trying to use the research that we do to impact and influence policy and programming that affects children around the world. So, a couple of minutes of background. The first thing to say is that what Young Lives tries to do, our goal, is to contribute to reduce child poverty, and we try to do that by creating a better evidence to help support policies and practices that can lead to gains for children experiencing poverty around the world. Part of the reason for emphasising that is that while we want to contribute to that, many of the actions that can help children are in the hands of others, so we're trying to support their actions. We do that by collecting evidence in what's called a cohort design. So we're following the same children as they've grown up in two cohorts and in four countries around the world. We do that to create a data set, and colleagues use that to do research on what matters for children, what helped them as they grew up. But that also creates a publicly archived data set for other researchers to use to try to generate new knowledge that can help for policy. And finally, I wanted to emphasise that this is a collaboration. The first thing is that the study relies on the inputs, large inputs, of children and families giving of their time and of their experiences. We've been funded generously by a number of donors, and the study happens because of partners in each of the study countries. On to our theory of change. Our theory of change is on the Young Lives website. I see theory of change as a tool that helps you think through the assumptions that you're making in terms of the actions you carry out and how you hope that those will lead to positive change. So helping you to tease out why you think that the actions that you're taking are going to lead to some positive change towards the goal that you have. So as you'll see on this slide, I've circled the channels, the different channels by which we hope that Young Lives activity from across the collaboration can lead to positive change. I won't talk in any detail about those channels, but I will just explain what they are. The first channel is capacity, a way in which new skills, new knowledge, new skills is built from within the study, and indeed with those that we work with, and we hope that that's one thing that can lead to positive change. Secondly, new research, new knowledge that can inform policy and programming as to what matters most in children's lives. Third, uptake. That's not just about research, it's about how that research is actually made to be really useful, how it reaches the right places. And fourthly, innovation, particularly perhaps around methodological learning about how others can learn from the types of things that Young Lives can do that can lead to better research and better outcomes, new tools. So in this slide, we just move along the continuum from inputs, outputs, and towards outcomes. Now, we've got a greater degree of control over some of those things, over the inputs, but as I say, part of the key for me about the theory of change is that you're documenting why you think that the inputs that you have a greater degree of control over will positively influence outcomes and then eventually impact. So some examples, and these are just a couple. You'll find that there's quite a few examples on the Young Lives website, so please do have a look at those. But these examples are really to draw out some kind of common messages that might be of wider kind of applicability. So first one, capacity development. The example I wanted to give here was about the development of the Ethiopian Centre for Child Research. That's an institution that's just been created within Ethiopia, but its origins really come from the slowly getting together of those who are working on research and programming and policy that is relevant for children in Ethiopia. And part of the inspiration for that came from a research project which identified that there was a need for spaces for people to meet, to talk about the work that they were doing, and that sort of space could help magnify efforts. So that identified a national demand for somewhere for people to talk to each other, for the research community to talk to each other. And in the fullness of time and with the work of a lot of people within Ethiopia, that's come through as the Ethiopia Centre for Child Research, now backed by UNICEF. That's a really important legacy that will live long beyond any particular research study and creates a vehicle, a space where more research can come forward that can be relevant for policy and programme. But it's not quick. So one really key contribution there is developing capacity for future efforts. Example number 2, working with intermediaries. The example I wanted to give here was research work on how violence affects children. Violence is a really big topic in many children's lives, different forms of violence around the world. This is some joint work with UNICEF's Office of Research. UNICEF's Office of Research had a large project trying to work out about the drivers of violence as affects children, which was also a very engaged project trying to work with national authorities to try to help support policy to reduce violence as it affects children. Well, colleagues teamed up with those groups within UNICEF. Some points I'd emphasise in terms of working with intermediaries. First, it expands our capacity as researchers. It helps us understand the audience for research much better than we otherwise might. It helps us understand the timing of when research might be needed and in what forms it might be needed. But it means that we have to be nimble, we have to be flexible to what that external demand might be. Third example, balancing policy demand and research supply. Well, maybe I've just already started talking about that, but often, perhaps in a traditional model of research, researchers sit down and think about the types of research questions which they feel it's important to answer, and there's a role for that. But it's also important to know why our research will be relevant, what the demand for it is within any particular country. So there's a need to balance policy demand and research supply. The example I wanted to give is around early child development, particularly in Ethiopia. And that was a research project which tried to meet some of the emerging needs for research on early child development in a fast-changing policy environment where the Ethiopian government has been committed to expanding its early child development services and provision. So this was a research project which has responded to that policy demand, trying to build an understanding of what's been going on and what some of the key challenges that are going to face that policy in Ethiopia. Things I wanted to emphasise from here is really that the importance of both policy demand but also timing, that it's really important that research occurs and is provided to those who can make a difference in a really timely way, because if you miss the boat, then that research won't be so useful as otherwise it might have been. One thing to balance that policy demand and research supply, of course, is that potentially this moves you away from the original research intention. That may not be a bad thing, but it's worth bearing in mind. So 3 common messages, perhaps. Additionally, first, research and policy cycles. Researchers and policymakers and people responsible for programmes operate on different cycles, different timelines. Research sometimes takes a long time. Policy moves quite quickly. Decisions are made quite quickly. Understanding when those decisions might be taken is going to be really important for how research can contribute to those sorts of questions. Secondly, relationships are absolutely central. Investing time in building those relationships is going to be really important for research to reach the right audience. And third, planning for serendipity. For me, it's a bit of a contradiction in terms, planning for serendipity, but you've got to be in the right places in the right times in order to have impact, and that perhaps goes back to this question about understanding policy cycles, about how decisions are being made. So finally, a couple of reflections just looking across the piece. First, different types of impact. One thing here is just to recognise that there are lots of different forms of impact. We describe 3 in the theory of change. I mentioned those different types of impact because I think it's important for research projects to recognise the breadth of potential impact that they can have. The first is capacity. So I've put that down here as a change in an individual's ability to do things, perhaps not just an individual, the ability of groups, the ability across the board, so an increase in capacity. Secondly, instrumental, something like a contribution to a change in the law, to a change in policy, a change in the types of delivery, say, that civil society organisations can do. So, and third, conceptual, a change in the debate, a change in the way of thinking about a particular topic area. So I think those are three areas that research can make some kind of an impact. Secondly, increasing the chances of impact. Well, in the previous slide, I talked quite a bit about some examples of impact, and I suppose across all of that, you have to ask the question about, well, why should somebody else make some kind of a change based on what you say? And part of that is making sure that what you do is very relevant and useful to them. So a couple of things about increasing the chances of impact. Well, the first starting point, thinking through what is needed, who can affect it, what is needed, and when that needs to happen. So being timely with research in terms of when decisions are being made. And secondly, flexibility to opportunities. Maybe things change, maybe opportunities arise. Being flexible to that feels very important in terms of being able to increase your chances of having impact. Third, assessing impact. Now, there's lots and lots of discussion about how you assess the impact of research on policy, on programming. And there are a number of issues about that. First, attribution or contribution. Are you saying that something would not have happened absolutely without you doing what you did? Or are you saying that there are multiple actors that have been involved in any kind of change, and what's your contribution to that? I think the contribution side is perhaps more realistic for a lot of changes because it recognises that there are many stakeholders that are involved in any kind of change. When impact happens versus when you need to report it, this is a perennial problem for research. Perhaps our impact happens after a funding window has happened, but our donors are understandably keen that we report on what's happened within that period. Perhaps that also goes back to why it's important to talk about pathways to impact, actions that you hope will in the fullness of time lead to some change. But it's a real challenge about when that impact might happen. Potentially it might happen years after a research project finishes. And verification. How do you get proof to a decent standard that what you did led or contributed to some kind of positive change? So those are really difficult challenges, but our approach to dealing with that, well, you'll see some of that on our website if you have a look at these case studies. But one key way in which we try to analyse, to understand and to verify that contribution is that we try to tell a story around a particular area. A number of those case studies documented, and where we have documentary evidence, for example, a finding being picked up in another report, a new tool being picked up by another research study, we would say that. If we can find some kind of quantitative way of demonstrating that, we'd certainly do that. But often these things are reliant in our experience by qualitative evidence, by quotes from influential others, from those who've had a real role in whatever change happened, who were able to talk about the contribution that we hopefully have made. And so we ask people for quotes, and we would use those to try to tell that story about how we saw what we did as leading some kind of change or contributing to it. So finally, a couple of references. Where would a research study be without references? So the first is the website, but so that's up there. The second is the theory of change. Well, I've talked quite a bit about that. The impact case studies, there are a number of those listed on the website. But two other things that I find quite useful. First, the Impact of Social Sciences blog. That's a blog on the London School of Economics website, and that's got a lot of discussion about how social sciences can have impact, how to understand that impact, how to measure that impact. All of those sorts of topics are up on that blog. And secondly, DFID's research uptake guide, some really practical examples there about how research projects can contribute to those real world changes. I think that's enough for now.